Hey listeners, welcome to What's the Big Idea? Here's a rare episode for me, a reaction to current events as they're happening. As the election continues to reverberate throughout the United States, I wanted to get a sense of how this is playing out in classrooms around the country, other than my own. So I reached out to Olina Banerji. She's a reporter at Ed Week, and she recently wrote a great piece about what she describes as the eerie quietness around the election in schools. We had a great chat about how the election is impacting students, teachers, administrators, and I want to share it with you, see if it jives with your experience, if it meshes with how things are playing out in your community. As always, leave a comment or question at Big Idea Ed, Instagram, X, and I hope you enjoy this conversation, and I hope you are processing the election in a healthy and productive way with your students and children.
I'm Olina Banerji, and I'm a reporter with Education Week, which is a national K-12 publication. And we largely cater to K-12 educators, school leaders, and policymakers, and just try to keep abreast of everything that's going down in public schools.
Well, Owen, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. I'd imagine anyone listening knows Ed Week. I describe it as like the New York Times of the education world, maybe is a fair way to put it.
That's a great analogy. I'm going to take it back to my editors. I don't think I've heard that one floating around, but yeah, thank you.
The paper of record. So I reached out to you because you recently wrote a great article in Ed Week called Schools Are Eerily Quiet About the Election Results, Educators Say. And I thought it was a great in-depth and nuanced take on how schools are wrestling with the election results. So maybe we just start big picture. In your reporting, what are some things you've been hearing from schools about the election?
I think, Dan, we made those calls the day the results were announced. In fact, I think the Republicans hadn't won the House yet; they'd won the Senate, but it was pretty clear that Donald Trump was going to be the next president. So we made the calls in the afternoon of Wednesday, and I think we were just trying to get a temperature check on how people were feeling. And big picture, my takeaway was that students were eerily quiet. Like I said in my article, they were not a lot of people were talking in school, not a lot of chatter, not a lot of. I believe in 2016, there was. There were a lot of tears. There were walkouts. There were protests in schools from students. But I think in this cycle, students just seem to not either want to talk about it, or they didn't care, or their fears were silent fears. I think the people that were talking about it were teachers. They were expressing either their concern or their possibly. I didn't personally speak to any teachers who were feeling happy about the results, but I did speak to some who were concerned, who had talked to their colleagues about what this result would mean. And the third category of people were principals. So I think they were just trying to manage emotions, and they were just trying to brace for impact, but that impact kind of never came. So that's I think big picture of what I saw.
Yeah, that's so interesting. The impact never came. And I would say that reflects my own experience in where I teach. How do you report a story like this? With so many educators and students around this country, how do you and your colleagues actually go about reporting a story like this?
I think the caveat is that we probably didn't get all the emotions and reactions in there, but I tried to focus on battleground states where I thought there'd be people there'd be split opinion about who should be president. Some of the states also had some battles over, the future of public education. There were educators, there were superintendents who felt differently about, how much power should public schools have. And there are places, for example, in Texas, there's been a big voucher fight going on for the last couple of years. So I tried to focus on educators who might be teaching in divided classrooms, who might be teaching in divided environments, and kind of get a sense of how are you dealing with this, right? So I think if you talked, I did also speak with educators in extremely blue states and extremely red states like Alabama, and you could see sort of the difference in perception of what they were dealing with, right? So even between Texas and Alabama, there were differences in how students were reacting. So yeah, I think we tried to focus on a variety of educators across the country. So the article really spanned people all the way from New Jersey to Nevada. So trying to get a sense of, and just a lot of calls and a lot of legwork.
Yeah, you note that across the country, disappointment, anger, and celebrations have been largely muted. So this isn't just the people who are upset are being sort of quiet. It's sort of everybody, even those who are happy.
Mhm.
What do you think is the biggest factor in that eerily quiet environment that we're finding in schools about this? It was such a build up to this election. I mean, it's all we talked about for months. And then, as you say, it's like crickets as soon as it's over.
I don't know if I can explain it, because I think as adults, we have a propensity to try and justify everything that's going on around us. And that's why I think there was a difference between how teachers were responding and how students were responding. And right before the results came out, my colleague did a piece on how students actually just don't want to talk about their political persuasions, even those that were voting. Yeah, they just didn't feel comfortable either sharing it, or they were over it, or they were saturated by the amount of news coming out. So that could have played a factor in also, the sort of silence that was so loud.
That's actually a great point. Just fatigue, maybe. Maybe,
Mm.
maybe just happy it's over. Were people willing to speak with you for the story? Was there any reluctance in speaking on the record with you about this?
Not a whole bunch. I was surprised because I didn't think, especially teachers, right? I think teachers are a little bit more vulnerable in terms of their exposure to all of this and their exposure to critique. So I didn't really face much of an uphill battle. Some people didn't get back, which was fair. Like they maybe didn't want to speak. They weren't comfortable. But most people I reached out to were just happy to share what they were experiencing. And I think that's partly because there wasn't a lot of stuff going on. So, they didn't feel like they were putting themselves in some kind of, in harm's way in talking about this. Yeah.
One thing that's interested me throughout the election cycle and certainly after the election is the schools and their mission, schools and their values, and how those values either jibe with the results or maybe are contrasted by the results of the election. Did you get any sense of that talking with particularly leaders, principals, administrators, how they were sort of fitting the election results with what they kind of saw as the mission or values of their community and school?
That's a great question. And I think this, I think the reality of what's happened might sink in over time. But that for that point in time, I can say that for school leaders in states where I think the result pretty much went how in red states where the result went pretty much how the students probably wanted it to go. I think there was more of a sense of, okay, this is done, let's move on, next thing. There wasn't a lot of reflection on what might happen to minorities in the school, or what might happen to protected classes, or just students feeling uncomfortable with the result because potentially those schools aren't, you know, maybe as diverse, or those schools 80, for example, 81% of the population of a school in a mock election voted for Trump, and that kind of reflected the results of how their town voted. So you can see there's this sort of like an overlap in values and the result. Not to say that there aren't students there who aren't feeling who are feeling uncomfortable, or there are students there who are in the minority and may want in the future some kind of reassurance from their leaders. In other places, I felt like because there wasn't a lot of chatter, there wasn't a lot of sort of like obvious fanfare about the election after the results, the principals were falling back on affinity groups, they're falling back on counselors to sort of help. help basically make kids feel safer, make kids feel more comfortable. I think what I did here was a lot of teachers talk about how some of their kids were worried about being deported or their parents being deported, especially, kids with Hispanic backgrounds, students of color. They're feeling dismayed, feeling sad, feeling kind of lonely, in after the results. So I think teachers were kind of seeing more in real time how those emotions were coming out.
Yeah, I should note that even since you wrote the article, the president-elect has started naming
Yes.
cabinet candidates that are affirming some of probably those students' worst fears. And
Yes.
and on that question, what do you, how do you foresee the next couple of months playing leading up to Inauguration Day? And what are you going to be looking for in your reporting? What stories do you think you'll be following as this develops?
I think some stuff has already come up. We've reported on racist texts going out to students of color in different states, and that sort of, that happened almost immediately after the results came out. And so we're seeing sort of a rise of threats against trans students and LGBTQ plus students who identify as LGBTQ plus, and we're going to follow that track very closely because repealing some protections under Title IX are going to impact not just students but also the educators that look after them or the schools that spend resources on supporting them. So that's definitely going to be something we're going to keep our eye out on. I personally want to see how, because I cover the principal beat, I personally want to see how school leaders are kind of affirming some of those values, like you said, right? Like you mentioned, how are the values going to be, how the value is going to play out with what happens politically. And one of the things are, a lot of our school leaders lead schools with diverse populations. A lot of them are going to be Hispanic kids who are going to be worried about deportations. They're going to be worried about their families being separated. So I foresee talking to a lot of people about how that's going to impact school culture, how are you going to protect students. And yesterday, I think, the Chicago Board of Education held an emergency meeting, and then they talked about how they're going to prevent ICE officers from coming into their school. So I think schools are more on the front line of this than people realize, and so there's going to be a lot of stuff coming out, from these clashes. So yeah, we're going to keep our eyes, all our eyes on that.
Yeah, it's going to be for some schools a real stress test on their values. I'm always fascinated by how prevalent schools make their values and how much they stick to their values in times of stress like this. And it's interesting, right? Because most students can't vote. They're not old enough to vote. But as you say, they really are now finding themselves possibly on the front lines of the consequences of the election. And
Yeah.
I wonder of the different stakeholders in schools, students, teachers, administrators, parents, even.
Yeah.
Who do you think is going to face who's going to face the biggest challenges over the next couple of months?
It's a great question. I don't know for sure right now, but I do think it's people directly responsible for looking after kids. So I think it's going to be teachers and principals who in real time face difficulties in either teaching sort of a social studies unit, for example, right, where there's going to be pushback on things like critical race theory, or schools trying to enforce SEL mandates, and there's going to be pushback against that. And like I said, there's going to be huge concerns and mental health concerns around the protections of LGBTQ plus students and students who may get deported or their parents may get deported. So I do think it's educators who are facing these realities with kids in real time.
Well, I appreciate your perspective on this, and will definitely recommend to all my listeners to stick with Ed Week. You're doing some great reporting on top of how all this is playing out. And Olin, I really appreciate you taking some time this morning to share your thoughts, and I'll put links to your article and all the Ed Week stuff that's been coming out in the show notes. And thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us this space, Dan.